Japanese cars, or JDM as the cool kids refer to it as. JDM is one of the largest and strongest cliques in modern automotive culture, holding a very large and dedicated fan base and legendary nameplates both historical and contemporary that have no issue withstanding the test of time. Names like Supra, RX-7, Skyline, Civic, Torino, Evo, the list goes on for days. This small island country has produced an impressive amount of cars since their entry into the automotive industry many years ago. And while the cars I just listed off have become essentially household names to car enthusiasts, it's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the variety of Japanese cars that are out there. There have been a plethora of very cool Japanese cars produced over the years that have unfortunately faded into the shadow of obscurity. And in this video, I'm going to be bringing a few of those cars back into the light. So here's 5 Japanese cars that you may have forgotten about. So the first car we have on this list is a variant of the Mitsubishi Mirage called the Cyborg. And you're going to have to forgive me for how short this segment's probably going to be, because apparently this car is extremely rare and obscure, and it was very difficult to find good information on it. I just scraped together what I could. The Cyborg was the performance model of the Mirage, at least in its first iteration. I believe after 1992, all the Mirage hatchbacks were just called the Cyborg, and the performance variant became the Cyborg R. It featured a turbocharged 4G61T engine pushing about 143 or 158 horsepower, the sources vary. It also featured all-wheel drive and was sold in sedan and hatchback form. This is somewhat a predecessor to the Evo, obviously less so than the Galant VR4, but mind you, the Mirage actually was a Lancer. I believe the first iteration is very rare, and with it weighing under 2,500 pounds and being all-wheel drive, I imagine this car is very nimble and responsive, and would probably be a blast to drive. I mean, look at these people. They wouldn't be cheering like that if the car didn't handle well. It'd probably be pretty dominant autocross, honestly. The Cyborg continued to be produced after the introduction of the Evo and after the Galant VR4 turned into a twin-turbo beastmobile. I can only guess this was seen as a less expensive alternative to the Evo. I actually only just found out about this car a few months ago when it appeared on Japanese Classics, and it made several appearances in Gran Turismo. I guess I just don't really remember it. Nonetheless, it exists, and it's pretty cool. The next car we have on this list is another Mazda with the initials MX, and that would be the Mazda MX-3. Other than the MX-5, there were a couple cars that bared the initials MX, which means Mazda Experimental. The other one was the MX-6, which was a big sports coupe. Anyway, the MX-3 was made from 1991 to 1998, and it did have a few different names under a few different brands, such as the UNOS Presso, AutoZam AC3, and UNOS 30X in Australia. Unlike the MX-5, the MX-3 was front-wheel drive, and it competed in a small sports coupe segment against cars like the Hyundai Scoop, Geostorm, Nissan NX, Saturn SC, and eventually the Honda Del Sol. The story would eventually end with the Del Sol cleaning house with all of them. Like, when was the last time you ever heard anyone talk about a Geostorm? Regardless of that fact, the MX-3 was still very well received when it was released, with its weight being between 2,414 and 2,582 pounds. It wasn't exactly as light as the MX-5, but it was still said to be very responsive and one of the best handling cars in its class. The MX-3 did have the Mazda B-Series engine, which was the same engine family as the Miata of the time, but it came with the 1.6-liter B6 ME producing a much-to-be-desired 88 horsepower, and the B6D producing a not as much to be desired, but still something to be desired, 103 horsepower. It also came with a B5 engine as the AZ3. The desirable engine was the 1.8-liter K8DE, which is a very strange V6 producing 130 horsepower, and being a V6, this really made it stand out amongst its competition because it was the only model to offer a 6-cylinder amongst a range of 4 cylinders. And being a 1.8-liter, it's a very tiny V6, even by early 1990s standards. But for being such a small V6, it still sounds pretty good. Unfortunately, along with most of its competition of the time, the MX-3 has been forgotten by the car community, and sadly, a lot of these cars have ended up in junkyards, and they're becoming a rarity to see on the road nowadays. They did have an aftermarket, but it's kind of, well, an unfortunate one. Who knows, maybe one day people will see the potential in these quirky little sports cars and start to resurrect them. Oh, and this thing even had back seats, but good luck with that. Now, as I just mentioned, one of the MX-3's main competitors was the Nissan NX, and that happens to be the next car that I've included on this list. The NX was this oddball center-based sport coupe that was sold from 1990 to 1996. And at first you may look at it and be like, oh my god, what the hell is that? But honestly, I feel like it's one of those car designs where the longer you look at it and the more you take in, the better looking it gets. And with that in mind, I honestly feel like it's a pretty good looking car. It also kind of looks like it used to have pop-up headlights, and once a safety legislation was passed that banned them, Nissan had to like scramble in order to redesign it to fit integrated headlights. The NX was referred to as the NX 1600 and NX 2000 in North America, as it came with a 1.6-liter GA16 and an SR20 DE. The engine choices were the same in Europe, although it was called the 100 NX. And in Japan, it was simply called the NX Coupe, but it additionally came with a GA15 as well as an SR18. And something interesting about the GA16 that it came with, the first 3 years that it was sold with the GA16 DS, which was actually a carbureted engine that made 95 horsepower, and in 1993, that's when they switched it to the DE, that was a fuel-injected system, and that one made around 115 horsepower. Additionally, the SR20 model made around 150 horsepower. Much like the MX-3, the NX was another nimble, lightweight car competing in the front-wheel drive sport coupe segment. In its lightest form, it weighed 2,248 pounds, which is less than the MX-3's lightest form, but in its heaviest, it weighed 2,513 pounds, which is heavier than the MX-3's heaviest form. As far as handling goes, the Nissan NX was very well regarded upon its release. It was reported to have very direct steering and a very balanced persona overall, even being able to break the tail end out under a hard slalom, but in a smooth, glided manner more so than a violent, snappy manner. MotorWeek even said that it handled like a smaller Mustang GT. The NX was not only referred to as one of the best handling cars in its class, but one of the best handling cars of its time, being put to the test by road and track against cars such as the NSX, 911, Miata 300ZX, and Lotus Elane. Although not that relevant in the tuner and motorsport scene today, in the early 90s the NX was commonly used in SCCA events, and it was proven to be quite dominant in showroom stock and improved touring classes against cars that should have been able to best it on paper. However, most of the NXs that you will find in the tuner scene nowadays are usually being powered by turbocharged SR20s and are known to be pretty damn quick. As a matter of fact, one of my first exposures to this car was when I met my friend Shane, and he was building a turbo NX 2000, and I didn't even know this thing was sold in the United States until I met him. Like, I knew the car was a thing, but I didn't know that it was actually sold in North America. So it was pretty cool to see that we actually got this little oddball coupe. But unfortunately, essentially like the rest of the cars that I've been naming on this list so far, it eventually faded into obscurity and is not really that popular amongst tuners anymore. But the people that do have them know exactly what they have, and they definitely know how to work with them. The next car we have on this list is actually the predecessor to the NX, and it may be the strangest car, actually no, it is the strangest car Nissan has ever made, and that would be the Nissan EXA, or in some regions, the Pulsar NX. The EXA had two generations, the first being the N12, made from 1982 to 1986, and the second being the N13, made from 1986 to 1990. We're mostly going to be focusing on the N13 because that's a really weird one, but the first generation definitely has its place, being one of the first small front-wheel drive sport coupes and weighing at a ridiculous 1,900 pounds. It even had a turbo model coming from the 103 horsepower E15 ET engine, and even though 103 horsepower really isn't anything, I imagine this thing would feel like a go-kart on back roads, being how obscenely light it is. The N13 received a much improved styling overhaul, as well as the adoption of the CA16DE and the CA18DE, however neither were turbocharged. The weight increased to 2,359 pounds, which is still very light. But this car has a very unique characteristic, which really stands out from every other car to ever exist: modularity. Now, when you say modularity, most people will think of something like the Moto Z. But what about a car? Well, the Nissan EXA had just that. No, not an interchangeable camera lens. Switchable rear deck panels, as well as a T-top. You wanted the coupe? Alright. You wanted the T-top coupe? You got it. You wanted the shooting brake? Go for it. You wanted the shooting brake with the T-top? Why not? This car could be anything short of a pickup. Oh wait, no. It could be a pickup too. This car was the definition of versatility. While there have been many concepts displaying interchangeable car parts over the years, Nissan is really the only company that actually went and did it. The EXA was really like no other car on the road at the time, or today, and we'll probably never see a car like that ever again, or at least not anytime soon, because no manufacturer would be brave enough to take such a design risk like that nowadays, and I'm sure it wouldn't pass several safety regulations. Much like many of the other cars on this list, the EXA also was a pretty well-handling and nimble car. The car was entered in several motorsport competitions over the years of its existence. And even though this thing was sold in the United States, I have yet to actually see one in person. I hope I do see one of these things one day, because I'd really like to take in what this car actually is in real life. And I imagine this would seriously stand out from the rest of the cars in the scene nowadays, because so far we really have yet to receive anything that matches this thing as far as weirdness goes. And the final car we have on this list is a very cool and relatively unknown hot hatch that's actually a WRC homologation, and that is the Mazda 323 GTR. The 323 GTR was introduced in 1992 as an homologation for Group A rally. It featured a turbocharged 1.8-liter BP engine that was pushing 207 horsepower, as well as all-wheel drive with a limited slip diff. It was an upgrade over the GTX model, which also competed in Group A rally, also all-wheel drive and had the same engine, except the GTX was only producing 182 horsepower. It also featured a unique body kit, which gave it a more aggressive front bumper, grille, hood vents, as well as flared fender arches. It also added stiffer suspension and anti-roll bars. This was a pretty hardcore hot hatch, like you could even replace the cup holders with an additional gauge cluster. And more or less, it was a direct competitor with the Pulsar GTIR. I only discovered the existence of this car like 2 months ago when I was watching a rally compilation, and I was surprised to see a 323 sliding around a corner like it was tuned by Cosworth. That's when I found out there was a performance version of it sold overseas. In the US, it was just an economy hatchback. We did get an all-wheel drive Protege, but it was an NA single overhead cam engine, so it was an all-wheel drive economy hatchback. Welcome to the United States of America, the land of we don't get jack shit. This car weighed around 2,800 pounds, and maybe it wasn't the lightest hot hatch at the time, but it could still definitely get around. And I did mention the GTX model a little bit earlier in this segment. The GTX model was actually introduced in 1985 and had been competing in WRC for several years prior to the introduction of the GTR, in which the rally version of the GTX was producing 280 horsepower and the GTR was producing about 300 horsepower. So, it ain't slow. And while both of these cars only finished best second, they were able to get a few podium finishes, which is still not unimpressive considering how difficult of a sport rally actually is. In rally, it's pretty much considered an accomplishment to finish the race at all. The GTX being produced in 1985 and the GTR being produced in 1992, they do exceed the 25-year rule, so it would be pretty cool to see these things come over into the United States. Although the GTR is the rarest one, and I imagine they won't pop up that often. Alright, well that's all I have for this video. Again, same as my video on the Hondas you may never have heard of, it's just another experimentation kind of thing. I'm trying to make this somewhat of a regular segment on my channel, so I'm kind of messing around with different formats and different recording and editing methods. For this one, I just decided to do a voiceover instead of actually recording close to myself talking and throwing it in the video. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. What do you guys think of the cars? Have you heard of any of these cars? Have you heard of these cars and you just forgot about them? Are there any other topics or cars you'd like me to go over in these types of videos? Let me know in the comment section. Other than that, I'm going to wrap this up and I will see you guys next week.